The mud was red with blood and the sky was black with smoke. Somewhere in the darkness of a shattered German forest in the winter of 1945, a young black soldier from Georgia knelt beside a dying man who had been trained to hate him. What happened next would challenge everything the world thought it knew about mercy, humanity, and the cost of war. This is not a story about victory. This is a story about what it means to be human when the world has gone mad. This is a story about a choice that no man should have to make, and about the courage it takes to choose compassion when everything around you demands cruelty. His name was Private James Henderson, though most folks back home in Savannah simply called him Jimmy. He was 23 years old, lean and strong, with hands that had picked cotton in the scorching Georgia sun before they ever held a rifle. He had grown up in a place where he couldn't drink from the same water fountain as white folks, where he had to step off the sidewalk when they passed, where his mother scrubbed floors in houses she would never be allowed to enter through the front door. And yet here he was, 5,000 miles from home, wearing the uniform of the United States Army, fighting for a country that did not fully see him as a man. The irony was not lost on him. None of the black soldiers felt it was lost on them. They fought anyway. They fought because their fathers and grandfathers had fought. They fought because maybe, just maybe, if they proved themselves brave enough, if they bled enough, if they died enough, America might finally look them in the eye and call them equal. Jimmy remembered the day he enlisted. It was December of 1942, just over a year after Pearl Harbor, when the whole nation was gripped by patriotic fever. The recruiting office in Savannah had two separate lines, one for white boys and one for colored boys. And Jimmy had stood in his line for 3 hours in the heat, watching white boys walk in after him and get processed first. When his turn finally came, the sergeant behind the desk, a heavy man with tobacco-stained teeth, looked him up and down like he was inspecting livestock, asked him if he could read, asked him if he'd ever been arrested, asked him questions no white recruit would ever have to answer. Jimmy answered them all, calm and respectful, because his mother had taught him that survival for a black man in the South meant swallowing your pride and keeping your head down. The sergeant finally stamped his papers and told him to report to Fort Huachuca in Arizona for basic training. Jimmy walked out of that office a soldier, but he did not feel like one. Not yet. Not when the country he was about to fight for still treated him like a second-class citizen. Fort Huachuca was where Jimmy learned what it really meant to be a black soldier in the United States Army. The fort was segregated. Of course. Black soldiers trained separately from white soldiers, ate in separate mess halls, slept in separate barracks. The training was harder, the equipment older, the respect non-existent. White soldiers would walk past them and spit. Officers would curse them out for the smallest infractions, call them names that cut deeper than any knife. Jimmy learned to shoot, to march, to follow orders, but more than that, he learned to carry a weight that white soldiers would never have to bear. The weight of representing his entire race. The weight of knowing that if he failed, if any of them failed, it would be used as proof that black men were inferior, that they did not belong in combat, that they should go back to picking cotton and shining shoes and staying in their place. But Jimmy and the men around him refused to fail. They trained harder than anyone. They pushed themselves past exhaustion, past pain, past the point where white soldiers would have quit. They did it because they had something to prove, not just to the white officers who doubted them, not just to the country that treated them like dirt, but to themselves. They did it because deep down they knew the truth that America refused to acknowledge. They were just as brave, just as capable, just as human as anyone else. And they were going to prove it, even if it killed them. Jimmy was part of the 92nd Infantry Division, one of only 2 black combat divisions in the entire European theater. The 92nd was known as the Buffalo Soldiers, a name that carried weight and pride stretching back to the Indian Wars, back to a time when black men had fought on the frontier and earned respect through blood and grit. But in 1945, that respect was still hard to come by. The division had been given the worst assignments, the least support, and the most doubt. White officers commanded most of the units, many of them Southerners who had never led black troops and did not want to. Some of those officers believed the men under their command were inferior, cowardly, incapable of real courage. They said it in reports. They said it to each other, sometimes they said it to the men's faces, and the men heard it. They carried it like a weight on their backs, heavier than their packs, sharper than the cold. The 92nd had been deployed to Italy in the summer of 1944, thrown into some of the most brutal fighting of the entire war. They fought through the Apennine Mountains, through mud and rain and cold that seeped into your bones and never left. They fought against German forces that were dug in deep, fortified positions that had been reinforced over months, positions that seemed impossible to break. And they fought against something else too, something that never showed up on the maps or in the after-action reports. They fought against the assumption of failure. against officers who expected them to break, to run, to prove every racist stereotype true. Some units did break, worn down by impossible missions and inadequate support and leaders who did not believe in them. And when they did, the reports said it was because black soldiers were naturally cowardly, naturally weak. The reports never mentioned the lack of artillery support, the missing supplies, the white officers who abandoned their posts. The reports only mentioned the color of the men's skin. But other units like Jimmy's, held the line. They took their objectives. They captured German positions. They proved again and again that courage had nothing to do with the color of your skin. Jimmy had been in combat for 6 months by the time that night in February came. 6 months of hell. He had seen things that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had seen his friend Marcus, a kid from Alabama who used to sing gospel songs while they marched, cut in half by machine gun fire. He had seen Corporal Washington, a man who had been like a father to half the platoon, step on a mine and simply cease to exist. He had held dying men in his arms, felt their blood soak into his uniform, heard them cry for their mothers in voices that got softer and softer until they stopped altogether. War had taught Jimmy that death did not care about your dreams, your plans, your reasons for fighting. Death just took you, sudden and brutal and final. It was February, and the 92nd had been tasked with breaking through the Gothic line in northern Italy, a series of German fortifications dug deep into the mountains, reinforced with concrete bunkers and machine gun nests and minefields that turned the snow red. The offensive was brutal. Men fell in waves. The cold bit through every layer of clothing. Frostbite took toes and fingers. Artillery shells screamed down from the heights, shaking the earth, turning trees into splinters and soldiers into memories. Jimmy had seen men he trained with, men he ate with, men he laughed with, torn apart in an instant. He had learned not to look too long at the faces of the dead. You had to keep moving. You had to keep your head down. You had to survive. That was all that mattered. Survival. On the night it happened, Jimmy's platoon had been sent forward on a patrol. The orders were simple. Scout the enemy positions, report back, do not engage unless necessary. It was the kind of mission that sounded easy on paper and got men killed in practice. Lieutenant Morrison, a white officer from Connecticut who had only been with the unit for 3 weeks, led them out. He was young, maybe 25, and he had that look in his eyes that all the new officers had. The look that said he was not sure if his men would follow him, if they would fight, if they would run when the shooting started. Jimmy could see the doubt in every order Morrison gave, could hear it in the way his voice wavered when he spoke. The men felt it too. They followed anyway because that's what soldiers do. They moved through the forest in single file, boots crunching on frozen ground, breath misting in the air, rifles ready. So there were 12 of them, moving like ghosts through the skeletal trees. The trees were stripped bare by shelling, their branches clawing at the sky like the fingers of the damned. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. Jimmy's stomach twisted. He had been in enough firefights to know what silence meant. It meant the enemy was close. It meant someone was about to die. He wanted to say something to warn the lieutenant, but what was there to say? The silence could mean anything. It could mean nothing. And a black private did not question a white officer's judgment, not if he valued his stripes. The explosion came without warning. A mine buried beneath the snow detonated under the feet of Private Johnson, the man in front of Jimmy. The blast was a wall of sound and light and heat. It threw bodies into the air like ragdolls, tore through flesh and bone, filled the world with fire and screaming. Jimmy hit the ground hard, ears ringing, vision blurred. For a moment he could not breathe. For a moment he thought he was dead. Then the gunfire started. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like lightning. Bullets snapped through the air, thudding into trees, kicking up dirt and snow. The Germans had been waiting. It was an ambush, carefully planned, perfectly executed. They had let the patrol walk right into their kill zone. Jimmy rolled behind a fallen log and returned fire, his rifle bucking against his shoulder. He could see shapes moving in the shadows, gray uniforms melting in and out of the smoke. His hands were shaking. His heart was hammering so hard it hurt. Men were shouting, cursing, dying. Lieutenant Morrison was screaming orders that nobody could hear over the gunfire. Private Lewis, who slept in the bunk next to Jimmy's, stood up to move and was immediately cut down, his body jerking as bullets tore through him. The platoon was pinned down. They needed to move, to fall back, but the machine gun fire was too heavy. Anyone who stood would be cut in half. Then, as suddenly as it started, the shooting stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was the silence of death, heavy and absolute. Jimmy lay there, gasping, waiting for the second wave, waiting for the final assault that would finish them. Slowly, carefully, he lifted his head. The Germans were gone. They had pulled back, maybe thinking the Americans were finished, maybe regrouping for another assault. It did not matter. The patrol was shattered. Half the men were dead or wounded. The survivors were scattered, disoriented, bleeding. Lieutenant Morrison was sitting with his back against a tree, staring at nothing, his hands shaking so badly he could not hold his rifle. He was in shock. They all were. Jimmy checked himself. No major wounds. Just scratches, bruises, the taste of copper in his mouth. He was alive. That was more than some. He looked around at what was left of the patrol. 6 men, maybe 7, the rest were gone. Some were obviously dead, bodies twisted at impossible angles, blood pooling black in the snow. Others were screaming, crying for medics, for their mothers, for God. Jimmy wanted to help them, but he did not know where to start. The world had become a nightmare, and he was trapped in the middle of it. He heard it then, a sound that did not belong. A low, wet rasping, like someone trying to breathe through water. It was coming from the other side of a shell crater, maybe 20 yards away. Jimmy froze. It could be one of his own men. It could be a trap. The Germans were known for using wounded soldiers as bait, waiting for medics to come running so they could cut them down. He knew he should call out, should wait for the others, should be smart about this. But something pulled him forward. Maybe it was training. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was something deeper than either. Maybe it was the simple fact that someone was dying, and every instinct Jimmy had told him that you did not leave people to die alone. He crawled toward the sound, moving slow, rifle up, finger on the trigger. His heart was pounding. Every shadow looked like an enemy soldier. Every sound made him flinch. The crater was deep, edges torn and ragged, the bottom filled with mud and snow turned black with blood and cordite. And there at the bottom was a German soldier. He was young, maybe younger than Jimmy, with blonde hair matted with blood and eyes that were wide and terrified. His uniform was shredded, soaked red across the chest and stomach. One leg was twisted at an angle that made Jimmy's stomach turn. The boy was dying. There was no question about it. He had maybe minutes left, maybe less. For a long moment, Jimmy just stared. This was the enemy. This was one of the men who had just tried to kill him, who had killed his friends, who wore the uniform of a regime that had murdered millions, that had built camps where human beings were turned into ash and smoke. Jimmy had every reason to walk away. He had every reason to put a bullet in the boy's head and be done with it. No one would have blamed him. This was war. This was what soldiers did. The enemy was the enemy. You killed them before they killed you. That was the rule. That was how you survived. But Jimmy did not walk away. He did not pull the trigger. Instead, he slid down into the crater, his boots sinking into the mud. The German boy flinched, tried to move, but his body would not respond. His lips were moving, forming words in a language Jimmy did not understand. His hand reached out, trembling, grasping at nothing. And Jimmy saw it. Saw past the uniform, past the flag, past the hate. He saw a kid. Just a kid. A terrified kid who was dying alone in the mud, far from home, calling for his mother in a language no one here would understand. The boy's eyes were blue, Jimmy noticed. The same shade of blue as the sky on a clear summer day back in Georgia. And in those eyes, Jimmy saw fear. Not the fear of an enemy soldier, but the fear of a human being facing the end. The kind of fear that transcends nationality, race, ideology. The kind of fear that strips away everything except the raw truth of mortality. Jimmy knelt beside him. He set his rifle down, out of reach, but still close enough to grab if this was a trick. The boy's eyes followed the movement, wide with fear, waiting for the shot that would end it. But Jimmy did not reach for the rifle. He reached for his canteen. He unscrewed the cap with fingers that felt numb, not from the cold, but from something else, something he could not name. He lifted the boy's head as gently as he could, cradling it in the crook of his arm. The German tried to pull away, but he had no strength left. Jimmy tilted the canteen, let the water touch the boy's cracked, bleeding lips. The boy drank, coughing, choking, but he drank. Water spilled down his chin, mixing with the blood and dirt. His eyes closed for a moment, and when they opened again, some of the fear was gone. Not all of it, but some. Then Jimmy did something that would have gotten him killed if any of his commanders had seen it. He opened his med kit, the one every soldier carried, the one that was meant for American boys, and he started working on the Germans' wounds. He knew it was hopeless. The injuries were too severe, the blood loss too great. There was no saving this boy. Any combat medic would have written him off immediately, would have used the morphine and bandages on someone who had a chance, but Jimmy worked anyway. He pressed gauze against the chest wound, tried to slow the bleeding, tried to do something, anything to ease the pain. The boy was crying now, tears cutting clean lines through the dirt on his face. He was saying something over and over, the same words, soft and broken. Jimmy did not know what it meant, but he knew what it was. It was a name, a mother's name, a sister's name. Maybe a girl's name, someone he loved, someone he would never see again. Someone back home who would get a telegram with a few typed words that would destroy their world. Jimmy held the boy's hand. He did not know why. It just seemed like the right thing to do. The only thing to do. The boy gripped back, hard, desperate, like Jimmy was the only thing anchoring him to the world. His grip was surprisingly strong for someone so close to death. And they sat there in the mud, in the dark, in a crater that smelled of blood and explosives and fear. An American black soldier and a dying German boy holding on to each other while the war raged on around them. There was no hate in that moment. No sides, no flags. No ideology. Just two young men far from home caught in the machinery of something neither of them had started or could stop. Just two human beings and the terrible knowledge that one of them was about to leave the world forever. The boy's breathing slowed. Each breath became harder, more labored, a wet rattle that Jimmy recognized from too many battlefield deaths. His grip loosened. His eyes, which had been locked on Jimmy's face with an intensity that burned, began to glaze over. The light was leaving them, slowly, like a candle being snuffed out. Jimmy kept talking, even though he knew the boy could not understand him. He talked about Georgia, about the smell of magnolia trees in the summer, about his mother's cooking, about the dog he had as a kid named Buddy who used to follow him everywhere. He talked about the river where he used to swim, about the church where he sang in the choir, about the girl he loved named Sarah who wrote him letters that he kept folded in his pocket next to his heart. He talked because silence felt wrong, because dying alone felt wrong, because in that moment, in that crater, nothing else mattered except making sure this boy did not leave the world thinking he was hated, making sure he knew somehow that someone cared, that his life mattered, that his death mattered. When the boy finally stopped breathing, when his hand went limp in Jimmy's and his eyes stared at nothing, Jimmy closed those eyes with his own hand. His hands were shaking. His chest felt tight. He wanted to scream, to cry, to rage at the stupidity of it all. At the waste. At the fact that this boy, who could have been a farmer or a teacher or a father, was now just another body in a war that had already swallowed millions. But he did not scream. He did not cry. He just sat there, covered in mud and blood that was not his own, holding the hand of a dead enemy, wondering what the hell any of this was for, wondering how men thousands of miles away could move pieces on a map and decide that boys like this, boys like Jimmy, should die for reasons most of them would never understand. He heard voices, American voices calling out, looking for survivors. Jimmy climbed out of the crater, leaving the German boy where he lay. There was nothing else he could do. The dead were beyond help. He picked up his rifle, checked the safety, and stumbled toward the voices. He did not say anything about what had happened. What was there to say? Who would understand? He had given water and comfort to an enemy soldier. He had wasted precious medical supplies on a boy who was going to die anyway, supplies that might have saved an American life. In the eyes of the army, in the eyes of most of his fellow soldiers, he had done something foolish. Maybe even something dishonorable. Maybe even something treasonous. But Jimmy did not feel foolish. He did not feel like he had dishonored anything. If anything, he felt like he had honored something deeper than flags or nations or the machinery of war. He had honored the simple, stubborn fact that every life mattered, even the life of an enemy, especially the life of an enemy. Because if you could not see the humanity in the man trying to kill you, if you could not recognize that he was someone's son, someone's brother, someone's beloved, then what the hell were you fighting for? What separated you from the monsters you were supposed to be defeating? Word got out anyway. Sergeant Crawford, one of the other survivors, had seen Jimmy in the crater, had seen him tending to the German. The sergeant did not say anything to Jimmy directly, but he told others. And the story spread through the company, then the battalion whispered around campfires. Debated in the cold hours before dawn when men could not sleep and had nothing to do but think. Some of the men thought Jimmy was crazy. Some thought he was soft. Some thought he was a damn fool who had risked his own life for nothing, who had shown mercy to someone who did not deserve it, who had betrayed his brothers in arms by helping the enemy. They said he should have put a bullet in the German's head and moved on. They said that's what any real soldier would have done. But others, a quiet few, looked at him differently after that, with something that might have been respect, might have been recognition, might have been a kind of awe. They had seen enough death, enough hate, enough pointless cruelty. They had killed men and watched men die and felt their own humanity slipping away bit by bit with every battle. Every body, every night spent lying awake wondering if they would ever be able to go home and be normal again. They understood that what Jimmy had done was not weakness. It was the hardest kind of strength. The kind that chose mercy when vengeance would have been easier. The kind that chose compassion when cruelty would have been justified. The kind that refused to let war turn him into something he was not. The kind that said, even here, even in hell, I am still a human being, and I will act like one. Private Williams, a quiet man from Mississippi who rarely spoke to anyone, approached Jimmy a few days later. They were sitting in a bombed-out farmhouse trying to stay warm, waiting for orders. Williams sat down next to Jimmy and stared at the fire for a long time. Then he said, I heard what you did. With the German, Jimmy tensed, waiting for the criticism, the accusation. But Williams just nodded. That took guts, he said. More guts than killing him would have. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. Jimmy understood. They both understood. They were both carrying the weight of what this war was doing to them, the weight of trying to stay human in a place designed to strip humanity away. The officers did not see it that way. Jimmy was called in front of his captain, a white man from Alabama named Captain Morrison, a hard man with a face like carved stone and eyes that never seemed to blink. Captain Morrison was not a cruel man, not by the standards of the time, but he was a man of duty, a man who believed in the rules, in the chain of command, in the clear moral lines that war was supposed to draw. He sat behind a makeshift desk in what used to be a village schoolhouse, and he looked at Jimmy for a long time before speaking. Private Henderson, he said finally. I've been hearing stories about you, about what happened during the patrol. Yes, sir, Jimmy said, standing at attention, staring at the wall behind the captain's head. You gave aid to an enemy soldier. Used your medical supplies on him. Yes, sir. The soldier was going to die anyway. Yes, sir. So why did you do it, Private? Jimmy did not answer immediately. How could he explain it? How could he put into words something he barely understood himself? Finally, he said, because he was dying, sir. Because nobody should die alone like that. Because it seemed like the right thing to do. Captain Morrison stared at him. The right thing, he repeated. Private, do you understand that your job is to kill Germans, not nurse them? Yes, sir. Do you understand that those medical supplies could have been used on American soldiers? On your own men? Yes, sir. Then explain to me why you wasted them. Jimmy took a breath. Permission to speak freely, sir. The captain nodded. Sir, I didn't see it as a waste. I saw a kid dying in the mud, scared and alone, and I thought if that was me, I'd hope someone would do the same. I thought maybe that's what we're supposed to be fighting for. Not just to kill the other side, but to stay human ourselves. To remember that the enemy is still human even when they're trying to kill us. The captain stared at him for a long time. Then he said something Jimmy never expected. He said, Private Henderson, you're a damn fool. Jimmy's heart sank. But then the captain continued. But maybe the world needs more damn fools like you. Maybe if there were more men willing to show mercy, willing to see humanity in their enemies, there wouldn't be wars like this in the first place. He paused. That being said, I can't have my men thinking it's acceptable to aid the enemy. I can't have them thinking that sentiment is more important than survival. Do you understand? Yes, sir. But I also can't punish a man for showing compassion, for doing what he thought was right. So here's what's going to happen. This conversation never happened. You never gave aid to that German, and you never, ever do it again. Is that clear? Yes, sir. Dismissed. Jimmy walked out of that tent not sure if he had been reprimanded or praised. Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe it did not matter. What mattered was that he had made a choice, and he would make the same choice again if he had to. He knew that now. He knew that whatever happened, whatever battles lay ahead, he would not let this war turn him into a monster. He would hold on to his humanity even if it killed him. The war ground on. The 92nd pushed forward, took objectives, lost men, gained ground, lost ground, bled and fought and survived. They broke through the Gothic line finally in April of 1945 after months of brutal fighting. They advanced north, liberating Italian villages, accepting the surrender of German units that had finally had enough. Jimmy kept fighting. He did not talk about the boy in the crater. He did not need to. It was burned into him, a memory that would follow him for the rest of his life. In the quiet moments, in the space between battles, he would see that boy's face, would hear the sound of his breathing, slow and wet and fading, would feel the weight of that hand in his, holding on with everything he had left. The Germans surrendered in May. Victory in Europe. The war was over, at least in Europe. Jimmy and the 92nd were slated to be sent to the Pacific to continue fighting the Japanese, but then the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and suddenly the entire war was over. Japan surrendered. It was done. After years of death and destruction, it was finally done. When the war in Europe finally ended, when the guns went silent and the soldiers started going home, Jimmy returned to Georgia. He walked off the ship in New York, still in uniform, with medals pinned to his chest. Bronze Star for valor. Purple Heart for wounds received in combat. campaign ribbons and unit citations. But those medals meant nothing to the people waiting at the dock. The white servicemen were cheered, kissed by strangers, given parades. The black servicemen were pointed toward a different exit, a side door, told to keep moving. Jimmy rode the train south, and with every mile he felt the familiar weight settling back onto his shoulders. The weight of being black in America. The weight of knowing that he was going home to a country that still saw him as less than. In Georgia, it was worse. He walked into a diner in Savannah, still in uniform, and was told to leave. The owner did not want colored in his establishment, veteran or not. Jimmy tried to register to vote and was turned away. Tried to get a job at the factory where they were hiring veterans and was told they only hired white men. He went to the hospital for treatment of an old wound that still ached and was made to wait in the colored section until all the white patients had been seen. He went back to a country that still made him ride in the back of the bus, still paid him less, still housed him worse, still treated him like he had not just spent years fighting and bleeding for freedoms he himself did not fully have. It was bitter, it was cruel, but it was not surprising. Jimmy carried the weight of it all. The weight of the war, the weight of the boy in the crater, the weight of being a black man in America, a veteran who had proven his courage and his humanity and still had to prove it every single day just to be treated with basic dignity. He did not talk about the war much. Most veterans did not. What was there to say? How do you explain to someone who was not there what it felt like to hold the hand of a dying enemy and realize that the enemy was just a kid, scared and alone, no different from you? How do you explain that you fought for a country that did not fight for you? How do you explain that you carried a rifle for freedom and came home to find that freedom was still just a word, not a reality? He got a job working at the docks, loading ships, the same kind of back-breaking labor he had done before the war. He married Sarah, the girl who had waited for him, and they had 3 children. He went to church every Sunday, sang in the choir, tried to build a normal life, but the war never left him. The nightmares never stopped. He would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, seeing the faces of the dead. Marcus, Corporal Washington, Private Lewis, the German boy. Always the German boy. Years later, long after the parades and the celebrations and the memorials, a journalist found Jimmy. She was a young black woman from New York, writing a book about the 92nd Infantry Division, about the black soldiers who had fought in Italy and France and Germany, soldiers whose stories had been buried under the weight of other histories, other heroes. She had heard rumors about a veteran in Savannah who had done something remarkable during the war, something that had become legend among the men who served with him. She tracked Jimmy down, showed up at his door one afternoon in 1968. Jimmy was older now, gray-haired, with lines in his face that told the story of a hard life, but his eyes were still sharp, still kind. She asked him if he had any stories worth telling. He almost said no. He had spent 2 decades trying to forget, trying to move on, trying to be normal. But then he thought about the boy in the crater. He thought about the hand in his hand. He thought about the choice he had made, the choice to be human when the world was telling him to be a killer, and he realized that maybe that story needed to be told. Maybe someone needed to hear it, maybe it mattered. So he told her. He told her everything. About the mud and the blood and the fear. About the German boy who died in his arms. About the way that moment had changed him, had marked him in a way no battle wound ever could. About how it taught him that the enemy is never just the enemy. That every person fighting on the other side is someone's son, someone's brother, someone's whole world. That war is not about good versus evil, but about human beings forced into impossible situations, forced to kill or be killed, forced to do terrible things and carry the weight of those things for the rest of their lives. The journalist wrote it down. She put it in her book. And slowly, quietly, the story spread. It was not a bestseller. It did not make Jimmy famous, but it reached people. Veterans read it and saw their own struggles reflected back at them. Young people read it and learned that war is not glorious, not an adventure, but a tragedy that destroys everyone it touches. Activists read it and saw proof that humanity and compassion are possible even in the darkest circumstances. The story became one small voice in a growing chorus. A chorus demanding that America live up to its ideals, that it treat all its citizens with the dignity and respect they deserved. Jimmy lived a long life. He worked hard, raised his family, watched his children grow up in a world that was slowly, painfully learning to see black men and women as fully human. He lived to see the civil rights movement, saw black Americans finally demand and win the rights they had been fighting for all along. He lived to see his son graduate from college, something Jimmy had never been able to do. He lived to see his daughter become a teacher, educating a new generation. He lived to see change, real change, even if it came too slowly and cost too much. He never forgot the boy in the crater. He never forgot what it felt like to hold that hand, to give water to a dying enemy, to choose compassion over hate. And when people asked him why he did it, why he risked so much for someone who would have killed him without hesitation, he always gave the same answer. He said because that boy was somebody's son, somebody's brother, somebody's whole world. And if the roles had been reversed, if I had been the one dying in that crater, I hoped someone would have done the same for me. I hoped that somewhere in that German boys' unit there was a man decent enough to show mercy to a dying American, to treat him like a human being instead of just an enemy. That's what I was hoping for. And that's what I tried to be. That is the story of Private James Henderson, a black soldier from Georgia who fought for a country that did not always fight for him. A man who, in the middle of a war that demanded cruelty, chose mercy. A man who saw an enemy and chose to see a human being. His story is not told in textbooks. There are no statues of him in town squares. His name does not appear on monuments. But his choice, that quiet act of compassion in a frozen crater in a German forest, echoes through history. It reminds us that even in the darkest moments, even when the world is burning, we still have a choice. We can choose hate or we can choose humanity. We can choose to be soldiers or we can choose to be men. Jimmy chose humanity. And that choice, more than any medal or monument, is what makes him a hero. The war ended. The soldiers came home. Some were celebrated. Some were forgotten. The black soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division came home to a country that still questioned their courage, still doubted their contributions, still treated them as second-class citizens. But they had proven something that could not be denied, no matter how hard people tried. They had proven that courage has no color. That heroism is not determined by the shade of your skin, but by the strength of your character. They had fought and bled and died for a dream of equality, a dream that would take decades more to even begin to realize. And men like Jimmy Henderson, men who chose mercy in the face of hate, who held on to their humanity when the world tried to take it away, became the quiet foundation upon which that dream was built. Jimmy Henderson died in 1989 at the age of 67. He was buried in a veterans' cemetery outside Savannah with full military honors. His children were there and his grandchildren, and a handful of veterans from the 92nd who had known him during the war. One of those veterans, a man named Robert Williams, spoke at the funeral. He said Jimmy Henderson was the best man I ever knew. Not because he was the bravest, though he was brave. Not because he was the strongest, though he was strong, but because he never forgot how to be human. In a war that tried to turn us all into monsters, Jimmy refused. He showed mercy when mercy seemed impossible. He saw humanity in the enemy. And he taught all of us that the real war is not against the men on the other side of the battlefield. The real war is against the hate and fear and cruelty inside ourselves. Jimmy won that war. And that's why we're here today. To honor a man who never stopped fighting for what was right, who never stopped believing in the dignity of every human life, no matter who they were or what flag they fought under. The story of Jimmy Henderson is not unique. There were thousands of black soldiers in World War II, men who fought with courage and honor, who proved their humanity in 1,000 small acts that no one recorded, no one celebrated. There were men who helped wounded enemies, who shared their rations with starving civilians, who chose compassion when they had every reason to choose revenge. Their stories have been forgotten, buried under the weight of official histories that focused on the generals and the politicians and the great battles. But those stories matter. They matter because they show us that heroism is not just about killing the enemy or taking the objective. Heroism is about staying human when everything around you is trying to make you into something less than human. It's about making the hard choice, the moral choice, even when no one is watching, even when no one will ever know. Jimmy Henderson made that choice, and in making it, he became more than a soldier. He became a testament to the power of mercy, the strength of compassion, the unbreakable resilience of the human spirit. His story reminds us that war does not have to destroy us, that we can endure the worst humanity has to offer and still come out the other side with our souls intact. It reminds us that every person we meet, even our enemies, is fighting their own battle, carrying their own burdens, trying to survive in a world that often seems designed to break them. It reminds us to see each other, really see each other, as human beings deserving of dignity and respect. This is the legacy of Private James Henderson. Not medals or monuments, but a memory of a young black man kneeling in a crater holding the hand of a dying enemy, choosing mercy when hate would have been easier. That memory lives on in everyone who hears his story. It lives on in every act of compassion, every moment of grace, Every time someone chooses to see the humanity in another person instead of just an enemy, a stranger, an other, that is the real victory. Not the battles won or the wars ended, but the simple, stubborn refusal to let the darkness win. Jimmy Henderson refused. And because he did, the world is a little bit brighter. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the cost of war, the power of mercy, and the courage it takes to remain human in inhuman times, please take a second to like this video. It truly helps us keep these untold stories alive. Stories of men and women who changed history but whose names have been forgotten, whose sacrifices have been overlooked, whose humanity shone brightest in the darkest moments. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us what you think about Jimmy's choice. Would you have done the same? What does this story teach us about war, about humanity, about the choices we all face when confronted with suffering and hate? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to discover more real stories of Black heroes whose courage, compassion, and unbreakable spirit changed the course of history and continue to inspire us today. These stories matter. These voices matter. And we need your help to make sure they're never forgotten again.